Hey everyone, my name is Jeffrey, and I work behind the scenes with Uri and Guerrilla Poker. I help produce and edit the YouTube videos and the courses, and I do some writing for the site, etc. This week, Uri is feeling a little under the weather, so in order to get a video out for you guys this week, he asked me to go ahead and do this one. With his help, of course. So for this week's video, we're just going to do a little analysis addressing something that came up in one of the YouTube comment threads. I think it was in the last video we published, where he made a passing comment about how suited connectors make good 3-betting hands, in part because of how they tend to conserve equity. Somebody asked him in the comments if he could expand on this concept a little bit, so that's what we're going to do in this video. We're going to explore suited connectors and this property of conservation, or preservation of equity. So first of all, why is this important to understand? Why can't we just memorize our 3-betting ranges and just use them at the tables? Well, there are a couple of reasons, and we've talked about this kind of thing before in previous videos, and some of it's obvious in a give a man a fish versus teaching a man to fish kind of way. But one interesting thing that happens that we haven't really touched on yet is that if you don't really understand why you're doing something, in the heat of the moment it can actually be pretty difficult to follow through. For instance, everyone knows that they should 3-bet aces, but some people might not like 3-betting, say, 10s in some spots, or king-queen, or ace-5 off, or 5-6 suited. There are a bunch of hands like this that people can see on charts and know that they're supposed to 3-bet these hands. But what we see a lot with students is that what happens in practice is that a lot of the non-obvious 3-betting hands get missed. And this is in live poker, online poker. These are professional full-time players playing for years, and they still just don't 3-bet these kinds of hands enough. And the reason seems to be this kind of cognitive emotional dissonance where they're just, scared that they're good call and lose. So even for seasoned players, when they're in the thick of it, these things are not always so cut and dry. So today we're going to try to help you to understand why it is we have these hands in our 3-betting ranges. And it's a pretty simple concept, but a cool one, and our goal is that once you understand it, you'll look down and see a suited connector and you'll look forward to 3-betting it. Because these hands do make money 3-betting. So let's try to understand why. So when you look at a 3-bet range, and what we're looking at now is a monk or solver range, 100 big blinds, big blind versus button, its various parts make sense, right? We have the value range, that's very clear. You have some stuff that's all over the place, and then you have these suited connectors, and these have a very constant presence in 3-bet ranges. If we look at other ranges, for instance big blind versus middle position, there's less junky stuff, but we can see the value range is still there, the all over the place stuff is there, and the suited connectors are there. And while you can see that these numbers don't represent all of the combos we could be using, if we compare to the other hands, for instance, if we compare 7-6, 6-5, 5-4 suited, and compare these to hands like ace-10 or jack-8 or pocket pairs, etc., you can see that the suited connectors are definitely overrepresented in these ranges. So to understand why this is, we need to take a step back first to before you 3-bet. You're in the big blind, and we'll specifically be looking at the big blind versus button ranges from here on out. So you're in the big blind, and you have a hand like a suited connector or king-jack off or whatever. We're facing a late position raise, single raise, reasonably sized is the assumption, so you're going to 3-bet or you're going to call. We're not talking about trashy hands that we consider folding here. So what we're comparing is not, is 3-betting better than folding, but rather, is 3-betting better than calling for these hands? So keep in mind that both options might be plus EV, but we want to look at which option is better. The next thing to consider is the basic structure of a 3-bet range. Fundamentally, it has to have value, and it has to have bluffs. Why bluffs? Because obviously, if we only 3-bet hands like aces and kings, then we get no action, right? We all know these guys. They 3-bet and it's like, oh yeah, the aces again? Okay, I fold. And we don't want to be these guys. We want action on our good hands. So the hands we choose to add to our 3-bet ranges don't actually need to make much money. Again, the purpose is essentially to pad our 3-bet frequency enough to be noticeable and get action on our good hands. So they're kind of making you money in an indirect way just by ensuring that the hands in your value range will be making more money. But they themselves don't need to print money, they just sort of need to hang in there. Now, one exception, of course, to the need bluffs rule is something that Uri talked about in another video recently, where he talked about recreational players who don't ever fold to 3-bets and how we want to remove suited connectors from our 3-bet ranges in those cases and just 3-bet more linear. But assuming we are in situations where we do want bluffs, then we need to decide which bluffs, right? What hands do we want in our bluff range and why? So this brings us to suited connectors and this concept of preservation of equity. So let's pull up Equilab and explore this. First, let's look at what happens when we call hands like 6-5 suited. So this is the button's opening range, and it's pretty wide, right? And against this range, we can see that 6-5 suited has about 38.8% equity. But if we 3-bet and get called, we're going to be up against a different range, right? He's going to 4-bet some stuff, he's going to flat some stuff, and what he flats us with should look something like this range. Some playable stuff, some good offsuit stuff, but a lot of the chaff has been trimmed. But even so, we can see that our equity really hasn't changed much. It was 38.8% before, and now it's about 38.1%, which is pretty negligible of a difference. And the reason this happens is because the hands that did get folded are all favorites against 6-5 suited. So even though the range got tighter, it hasn't really narrowed in a particularly bad way for our hand. A 6 folded, 8-6 suited folded, 10-6 suited folded, Jack-5 suited. These are all hands that make us very happy to see folded against 6-5. And, we do have kind of a tricky hand that's looking to outflop our opponents, but we're now a lot less likely to be dominated when we hit, a backup plan, say, of a low pair, for instance. Now, let's compare this to another type of hand that is also a candidate for padding our 3-betting range. For instance, let's look at King 10. First, looking at King 10 versus the original opening range, we see that King 10, when just calling, has over 51% equity. And this is huge, right? This is already a massive difference. Just calling a hand like this is massively more profitable than just calling with a low-suited connector. But if we see how King 10 does against the 3-bet calling range, we see that its equity drops to about 45%. This is an absolute drop of about 6%, but as a percentage of the original equity, it's more like a 12% drop, which is not at all insignificant. So King 10 is maybe a bit obvious of an example, but let's look at something even more junky. For instance, King 8 offsuit. So King 8 calling still has about 46% equity, which is still a lot more than 6-5 suited. That's not such a bad hand to be against the full range. But if we 3-bet and get called, it drops to about 41% equity, which again is a non-trivial drop of about 11 to 12% of its original equity. And this is true for a lot of hands. But it's interesting to compare this effect to value hands. For instance, something like jacks. Of course we're 3-betting jacks, but if we did call, it starts out at 71% equity. And against the 3-bet calling range, it barely changes. We see something similar with, let's say, ace-queen suited, where it starts out with a 63 to 64% equity, and only drops to about 61% when 3-betting called. So this property of preservation of equity is something that these suited connector hands and very strong value hands have in common. In the case of the suited connector, they're happy to see certain hands folded, whereas for the really strong hands, it's more like, it's a shame you folded all those really shitty hands that I was crushing, but hey, I don't really care, because your entire range is trash to me. I will crush you anyways. So, different reasons, but it's a similar effect. And you can see that this effect doesn't actually extend that far, right, when you're looking at just the value hands. Obviously, our really strong value hands are overrepresented in our 3-bet ranges, but when we start going down the line, for instance, to king-queen offsuit, we can see that we start seeing this equity drop become more and more significant, which is why these hands start to mix. Because if you 3-bet too much now, you're starting to kind of waste this growing and non-trivial margin of equity. So just to address some of these other hands that we see in our 3-bet ranges, it's important to note that everything has a purpose. For instance, we already discussed that if somebody is overcalling, we want to depolarize our range and get involved with, more medium strength stuff, get rid of some of that junky stuff and suited connectors, because as people stop folding, your bluffs make less and your value hands make more. It's important to remember that part of the reason that 3-betting makes money in the first place is fold equity. That is part of the equation, so we definitely need to adjust if we have no fold equity. We do have to remember that hands like 6-5 suited are technically a bit junky. It's a sexy hand when you hit a big hand like 2-pair or a straight in a big pot, but we really don't want to be inflating the pot with hands like this if we don't have fold equity. On the other hand, if somebody's overfolding, we do want to polarize our range more and add a bunch of junky stuff. Because if we're just 3-betting linear and 3-betting stuff like king-queen, it's a big waste, right? We're choosing to lose some equity with that hand when really we could just be 3-betting King 8 or 7-5 suited because villain's going to be folding tons anyway. So as we saw, these hands are much happier about getting those folds than the linear stuff like King Queen. Now, when we look at actual solver ranges, we do see kind of a mix of all this stuff in there. And that's because, as I said before, every hand type tends to play a role. In this case, the solver's playing against a villain that's properly mixing its strategy and always adjusting perfectly to any deviation. So, for instance, the reason we put junky hands in our range is because if we didn't have them there, a perfectly adjusting villain could just start overfolding. They'd know that we're weighting too much towards value and stronger hands and would gain EV by folding more. But in reality, we're not going to be seeing those kinds of perfect adjustments. We're not playing against world-class players for the most part, so against most villains, we're fine with unbalancing our play a bit to exploit their tendencies without worrying too much about getting burnt in return. Now, as a last word, we'll just point out that the solver says that 3-betting either 6-5 suited or King 10 versus a button open is fine. They're both something that you're going to do sometime. Right, if we look back at the 3-bet range here, we see that King 10 is there, Queen 9 is there, all these hands are in there, as are the suited connectors, and none of these hands are printing money. But if you have a choice between the two, and you're against a villain who's not drastically underfolding, if you have one or the other type of hand and you have to pick which one you'd rather 3-bet, then you'd rather call with the King 10 and 3-bet the 6-5 suited. Because as we've seen, it's simply a more efficient use of the equity of both hands. We'd rather pick bluffs that don't mind the calling ranges getting narrowed. Okay, so that's it for this week's video. Feel free to leave some comments for us on the YouTube channel. Let us know what you like, what you don't like, what kind of videos you'd like to see in the future. As always, if you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe to the channel. Check out some of our other videos. There's definitely some good stuff in there for you. Definitely check out the Guerrilla Poker website if you haven't done so yet. We got some great stuff there. We have Uri's first course, Redline Philosophy and Practice, which is a course about improving your red line, which, as we all know, is the sexiest color of lines in poker. Also be sure to check out our pre-flop solutions, which are GTO ranges that we've solved for various stakes and rake structures, and also for various environments such as a live casino environment, where bet sizes tend to be a little bit bigger and ranges can drastically change. Thanks for watching this week's video, and we'll see you next time.